In the second session, we will focus more on some of the requirements, and in particular, the nature and availability of data that are required to develop and run a value-based healthcare system. In the third session, we will focus more on the patient perspective and how value-based healthcare might benefit patients and their relatives. The initial ideas for this series came from Mark Cavanan and David Dunn from Janssen Pharmaceuticals. We quickly got Bridget Cunningham from Novartis interested, and off we went with planning. Thank you to the two companies for their support for this webinar series. During this whole process, we have been supported very competently by Sandra Flood and her colleagues from Wilson Hartnell, who have helped organizing the program, secure the speakers, and providing the technical solution for this webinar. I and my colleagues are very proud to welcome our speakers and thank them for their willingness to share their knowledge and experiences with us. We are also grateful to the former HSE General Manager, Tony O'Brien, for agreeing to take the role as moderator for this webinar series. Before I hand over to Tony, I just want to take the opportunity to thank all the participants for taking part in this webinar. We are very pleased to see the major interest in this event. You might want to know that our second webinar will take place on the 6th of April at the same time. We hope to see you there as well. Without further ado, I'll now hand you over to the moderator, Tony O'Brien. Tony, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jan, and it's my privilege to be part of today's webinar. So the structure is we have three highly distinguished speakers. Sorry, slight problem with muting there. Three highly distinguished speakers who are going to make presentations. That will be followed by a panel discussion and then a Q&A. And if you look to the bottom right of your screen, you'll see where you can submit questions for the Q&A, and we'll try and take as many of them as we can towards the end of the session. Our first presentation is from Dr. Leslie Tilson, Deputy Head and member of the Senior Management Team at the National Centre for Pharmacoeconomics, and you're very welcome, Leslie.
Thanks, Tony, and thanks to Jan for the invitation to speak at the webinar today. I'll just start by sharing my slides. 1 second. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a HTA agency and the role that HTA plays in informing risk sharing and performance-based reimbursement for pharmaceuticals in Ireland. So I will begin with some background information about the role of the NCPE in the HTA process and providing some background information on performance-based agreements. And then I will discuss two particular case studies for one-soft cell and gene therapies and finish with highlighting some future challenges. So the NCPE is an independent body that was originally established with the aim of advancing expertise in the discipline of pharmacoeconomics through practice research and education. It was established more than 20 years ago, and over this time the role has evolved, and now one of the primary functions is to conduct HTA of all new medicines. This is done in line with the framework agreement between the Irish Health Service and the pharmaceutical industry. And the actual reimbursement process for medicines in Ireland involves a number of key steps. So it begins when there's a CHMP positive opinion in Europe for the medicine. An applicant company can make a reimbursement application anytime from the CHMP positive opinion. At that stage, the HSE commissioned the NCPE to conduct a HTA, and the NCPE report is used by the HSE Drugs Group and the HSE leadership when making reimbursement decisions in relation to medicines. So the criteria that the HSE are required to consider when making reimbursement decisions is outlined in legislation in the 2013 Health Act. And there are 9 criteria that they are required to consider. So the NCPE HTA reports provide a systematic evidence-based appraisal which address 3 of these criteria: the budget impact, the clinical evidence, and the cost effectiveness. And throughout the process, there's also engagement with both clinicians and with patient organizations. So the types of products that we evaluate have evolved over the years, and there's a general trend in pharmaceutical policy towards the approval of medicines at an earlier stage where there is less robust evidence available. And this brings challenges. And in particular, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of one-off cell and gene therapies. So these have been associated, these are one-off treatments, so they're associated with a very high upfront cost. And the challenge is that there's a time divergence between this high upfront cost and potential long-term benefits. So there may be quite a considerable period of time before the benefits are realized. There's also the potential that there will be irrecoverable costs if the treatment does not prove to be effective. And this contrasts with repeat dose treatments, where if a patient does not continue to benefit, the treatment will cease and the payment will also cease. So there is, from a payer's perspective, it's this irreversibility associated with these one-off treatments that drives a great financial risk. And also the consequences of decision uncertainty. So the uncertainty in the evidence at the time that decisions are made, it's much greater when you're making a once-off payment upfront compared to for repeat dose treatments. So there's a number of types of different risk-sharing agreements, and performance-based agreements are one of those. So there's also financial-based agreements, and these tend to feature most prominently within the Irish reimbursement system for medicines. So these usually consist, for example, of simple price discounts or budget caps, or there may be caps on dosage or utilization. There may be a number of months that are free of charge with treatment, or companies may agree to match the price of comparators. So these are simple to administer. They are confidential in nature, but they are very effective, and they help to reduce budget uncertainty. And there's a lot of familiarity with this process within the Irish reimbursement system. In relation to performance-based agreements, these may occur at a population level and also at an individual patient level. And an example of population level performance-based reimbursement would be conditional reimbursements or coverage with evidence development. These don't really feature within the Irish healthcare system, but an example would be the Cancer Drug Fund in the UK. So it involves the collection of additional evidence, but the treatment is made available, and then evidence is collected over usually a period of a few years, and then the treatment would be reassessed, and a decision then would be made as to whether to continue funding the drug depending on the evidence. In relation to patient level performance-based reimbursement, this is where individual patient applications need to be made, and usually there are specified criteria according to which the treatment will be made available. And this has featured more recently within the Irish system through the use of managed access protocols, which have been implemented by the Medicines Management Programme. There's a number of examples of these on their website, for example, biologics for the treatment of atopic dermatitis and the new treatments for migraine, for example. And the purpose of these is to ensure that eligible patients are receiving treatment, and there are specific criteria for patients to be prescribed these treatments, or they can also be used to ensure appropriate prescribing. So, for example, they may include, for example, stopping rules. So I'm going to focus now more on the case studies for the one-off cell and gene therapies. And there's 2 specific examples that I've included. One is a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, and the other is a chimeric antigen receptor therapy. So Anna Semnogene Abeparvovec, it's difficult to pronounce, but the brand name is Zolgensma. This is a treatment for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a neuromuscular condition that affects very young children. It has a very poor prognosis, so life expectancy without treatment would be for 2 years or less. And this is a once-off intravenous infusion that can be administered to patients. And it has recently become available in Ireland. The HTA was completed in April 2021, and this was done as part of a joint HTA undertaken as part of the Benelux process. The company sought reimbursement in a subgroup of the licensed population, and this was for all symptomatic SMA type 1 patients and pre-symptomatic patients. The ICER was high. It exceeded the 45,000 euro per quali threshold. It was almost 300 euro per quali, so it was not deemed to be cost effective at the proposed price of 2.29 million euro for a once-off dose. It was estimated that there would be 4 patients per year eligible for this treatment in this subgroup of the licensed population, and the net budget impact over 5 years associated with this was 26 million. If it had been examined in the full licensed population, it's estimated that there would have been about 21 patients eligible in the first 2 years per year in the first 2 years. So this slide shows the clinical evidence that's available for this drug. It was very limited. It consisted of 4 single-arm studies and 2 long-term follow-up studies. There was a lack of comparative effectiveness data versus the relevant comparator, which is nusinersen, which is current standard of care at the moment in Ireland. And the HTA report highlighted that the quality of evidence at the time of decision making was low. It consisted of single arm, uncontrolled studies, small patient numbers, and limited follow-up. So the HTA report outlines that the clinical evidence suggests benefit in some patients. However, the design and follow-up of the clinical trials are such that there remains significant uncertainty in the medium to long-term outcomes in terms of both safety and efficacy. So following on from this, the NCPE recommended that the drug was not to be considered for reimbursement unless cost effectiveness could be improved relative to existing treatments. And then this followed a period of negotiation between the company and the HSE, and the NCPE evaluated the impact of confidential commercial proposals on the cost effectiveness and budget impact using the economic models that formed part of the HTA submission. And in June 2021, the HSE Drugs Group recommended reimbursement following these commercial negotiations. Pricing was approved following a joint negotiation under the Benelux initiative, and on condition that there would be a managed access protocol in place, which is implemented by the Medicines Management Programme. And this protocol is published. It outlines the specific criteria for patients to receive this treatment, and that is in line with the application that the company made for reimbursement for a specific subgroup of the licensed population. And the drugs group minutes are available online, and these outline the decision-making process, so that the drugs group in the majority were in favour of reimbursement if the specific terms set out in a joint mandate were to emerge. And this was based on the recommendations arising from the HTA that was conducted collaboratively between Ireland, the Netherlands and Belgium. So I'll move on then to the next case study, which is for the chimeric antigen receptor therapy, CAR-T, specifically look at TZIG and Laclusol. So CAR-T has been hailed as a major advance in hematology in recent years, and it's been termed to be the future 5th pillar in cancer treatment. And this slide shows the process for administering CAR-T. So it involves removal of the patient's own T cells, followed by in vitro activation of the T cells, and then infusion back into the patient. And there's two indications for T-agangliocclusal. One is in adult patients for relapsed refractory diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and the other is for pediatric and young adults in ALL. So in this case study, I'm just focusing on the adult indication. And relapsed or refractory DLBCL is associated with a poor prognosis and is particularly challenging to treat, so it's associated with a high unmet need. And the HTA was completed in September 2019. And again, the ICER in the HTA exceeded the €45,000 per QALY threshold, so it was close to €200,000 per QALY at a cost per patient of €300,000, and that was a once-off cost. The 5-year net drug budget impact ranged between 20 to 30 million euro. And the HTA report concluded that treatment with this drug is associated with particular institutional requirements, extremely high upfront costs, and a limited evidence base. So the HSE faces the possibility of huge unrecoverable costs should this treatment not prove to be as effective as suggested by this highly uncertain evaluation. And this slide just shows some of the evidence that was included in the HTA submission at the time the decision was made. So there were two studies included in the HTA submission, and this is one of them by Schuster et al., published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And it shows that after a period of 12 months, 50% of the treated patients did not survive when on this treatment. And notably, there was no comparator arm, it was a single arm trial. So it just shows that the risks involved when you're paying upfront the full cost of the treatment. And in terms of the post-HTA phase, well, the NCPE also recommended that this drug not be considered for reimbursement unless the cost effectiveness be improved. The NCPE, there was a period of commercial negotiations between the HSE and the company, and the NCPE evaluated the impact of confidential commercial proposals on the cost effectiveness and budget impact. The HSE drugs group did recommend reimbursement, and in June 2021, reimbursement was approved, and St. James's Hospital is the designated centre for administering CAR-T in adults. And I have a picture here with Dr. Larry Bacon and his team where they've administered the first CAR-T in December 2021. And again, the HSE drugs group minutes highlight that the commercial proposal improved the cost effectiveness to a level that was considered acceptable. And given the improvement in the commercial offer, the unmet need and the potential to offer a prolonged response and survival in some patients, there was a unanimous decision to support reimbursement. So this slide is just showing, while the commercial negotiations are all confidential, this is just shown for illustrative purposes to show the theoretical impact of a performance-linked reimbursement and how this can impact on cost effectiveness and budget impact. So, for example, if we have a drug and the list price is 500,000 upfront, it gives an ICER of 125,000 per QALY with a net budget impact of 25 million euro. If in scenario 1, 50% of this payment is made up front, and then 25% is made for patients that survive to the end of year 1, and then another 25% alive at the end of year 2, the 25% is paid at that stage. So it's phased over a period of 2 years. This becomes more cost effective with an ICER of 75,000 euro, and the budget impact reduces. And then scenario 2 is where the payments there's annuity payments over a longer period of time. So 20% is paid at the end of each year for patients that are alive over a period of 5 years. And then the ICER comes lower then at 45,000 euro. So if scenario 1 was the preferred scenario, there still would need to be some other form of financial agreement to result in a cost-effective treatment. And then finally, just to show that the decisions that are made at a particular point in time, but the evidence continues to emerge for all of these therapies. And this is a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine last month. It's a randomized controlled trial for T-cell in an earlier line of therapy, and it showed that there was no event-free survival benefit versus standard of care. And it's really just shown to illustrate that, you know, the evidence is still emerging and it's still being established which patients will benefit the most from these treatments. And there is an argument that, you know, there should be more of an evolving dynamic process for evaluating these therapies. And then finally, just to mention some future challenges. So there is this trend towards accelerated approval of medicines with limited evidence. And some of these medicines are potentially curative for patients. But there's a very high risk when there's a high cost once-off treatment. And it's a very high risk for the HSE in terms of financial risk. With horizon scanning, we expect that there will be increased requirements for these types of agreements, but as the number of patients that will be receiving these treatments grows, this can become quite burdensome in relation to the data that is required to manage these types of agreements. There's also consideration really should be given to the agility of the process to assess the impact of emerging evidence and also the changing market dynamics. For example, there are 2 more CAR-Ts that are now licensed for the DLBCL indication. It is possible for economic models to be used to periodically evaluate the impact of these agreements, and it's actually a subject that is currently one of the assessors at the NCPE is looking at in her PhD. And then finally, the performance-linked reimbursement agreements, they're not a substitute for high quality randomized controls and robust clinical evidence. However, they may have value in addressing this financial risk in the absence of that information. So thank you very much. And finally, I'd just like to acknowledge the work of Niamh Carey at the NCPE, who is doing a lot of research on this topic for her PhD. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, for a very intensive sharing of information there and a very insightful presentation that I'm sure everyone's enjoyed. Just a reminder that after all 3 presentations, we will be having a panel discussion and a Q&A, and the Q&As can be loaded onto Zoom through the Q&A function to the bottom right. Our next panelist is Dr. Panos Kafalas, who's Director of Access Strategy at Catapult Cell and Gene Therapy. And you're very welcome, Panos. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to share my screen and my presentation. Is this in full screen? Can I check?
Yep, it's good.
Thank you. I am building further on the case study presented by Leslie on the CAR-T Kymriah, as well as another CAR-T Yescarta. And here we're looking at the pricing reimbursement environment in the UK and the big 4 EU markets, France, Italy, Germany, and Spain. Okay, I'm trying to progress this. Okay, here we are. Right, a couple of slides at the start to just summarize the principles underlying how innovative therapies are assessed and admitted to reimbursement in most countries worldwide. These follow the principles of value-based assessments. There are countries that in certain circumstances would follow a cost-plus approach, as we've seen in certain scenarios in Japan, where the reimbursed price is built on the basis of manufacturing costs and a profit margin. On top of that, or prices that don't directly follow value-based assessments, but they follow international price referencing. But then again, most of the markets, the countries that they tend to reference, follow some form or another of value-based assessments. So value-based assessments have an impact worldwide. And the simplified concept behind a value-based assessment is diagrammatically displayed here, where you look at the reference value, in other words, what benefits existing therapeutic alternatives deliver, if they do exist, in other words, the standard of care. Otherwise, we're talking about the best supportive care. And then what added value the novel therapy delivers in terms of, and that can be looked from the perspective of positive differentiation, but also what negative differentiation that novel therapy is associated with, for instance, management of substantial side effects, as we have seen with CAR Ts and the cytokine release syndrome. What is important here to remember is that this value largely depends on the therapeutic position within a given indication. So if we think about Kymriah and how it has been positioned in advanced patients who have not responded to existing lines of treatment, if the label was to be expanded to an earlier use, for example, first line acute myeloid leukemia, then that whole value proposition changes as well as the pricing potential. Now, the same concept but put into health economic terms. How do we define value? So we look at the healthcare costs displaced as well as the monetized health gains. And in some countries, and that does not include the UK, societal gains in terms of increasing work productivity. The health gains, again, they're captured in different ways. In the UK, they follow the cost utility analysis and therefore the use of the quality adjusted life years. Now, how these benefits are translated to price, there are different mechanisms. So one of them is the cost effectiveness analysis. In other cases, this is complemented or substituted by budget impact analysis. And that brings us to the next slide that I'm sort of providing a brief overview of the cost utility analysis framework for those who are less familiar with it. And the essence of it is to capture the differences in costs and health gains between the treatment, the novel treatment, and the treatment that is replacing. And we've heard from Leslie that the use of the €45,000 threshold per QALY gain in Ireland. In the UK, we also have an end-of-life criterion for those diseases targeting patient, for those therapies targeting patient populations with limited life expectancy, where that willingness to pay can increase up to £50,000. In the recent NICE methods review, disease severity modifier has been included to help adjust the baseline willingness to pay according to the disease severity up to the 50K figure. And then for very rare conditions, the ISA can go up to £300,000, and that depends on the magnitude of the QALY gain. As much as there is no direct rarity modifier, the therapies that are channeled through a particular assessment framework, which is called the highly specialized technologies evaluation framework, do qualify for that higher ISA of £100,000 to £300,000. Now, as much as the framework rewards gains in life years and quality of life, and it covers typically for potentially curative therapies such as cell and gene therapies, the long-term horizon from the time of the therapy's administration all the way to the patient's death based on life expectancy and curative scenarios. However, the discount rate used disadvantages one-off therapies with long-term benefits because unlike therapies that are given on a chronic basis, the costs and benefits are distributed similarly in that long-term horizon, but with cell and gene therapies will have that imbalance where you may be paying up front, but the benefits materialize long-term. And those long-term benefits, if they're discounted at a high discount rate, then that erodes the value proposition and obviously the reimbursed price potential of those therapies. So a lot of focus has been placed by industry associations to allow for that challenge that ATMPs present in the cost utility framework and bring down the discount rate from 3.5 to 1.5. Also, percent, that is. Also, these frameworks can accommodate for model data, and that is one of the ways that we can account for data uncertainty, especially when long-term claims are made in the absence of clinical data, and this can happen in the form of extrapolations. This is just an illustration to convey the key message here that whenever we talk about health gains and costs, and we're comparing the novel therapy versus the standard of care, we're actually looking at the entire disease trajectory from the moment of the therapy's administration all the way to a patient dying. So for those therapies that are given early in life, this type of value-based assessment will look at cumulative benefits and costs from young age all the way to death, and that can be in a 100-year period, for instance, for the purpose of the health economic analysis. In parallel, we have budget impact considerations because a therapy can be cost effective, but when you look at the number of patients that need to be treated, then it may exceed the affordability thresholds that a particular healthcare system may be operating. So for example, in England, they operate the 20 million net budget impact threshold or trigger point, beyond which commercial negotiations with NHS England are needed in order to support the corresponding cost-effective price, and that may be with respect to the number of patients treated, which would need to be modulated. Alternatively, the price may need to reduce in order to have quick access to the entire eligible target patient population. As Leslie mentioned, there are lots of challenges with these therapies. For a start, they make curative claims, but the lack of long-term data at launch, which is difficult to overcome unless you can leverage biological plausibility arguments. Therefore, in one way or another, you will not have the clinical data that HTA bodies are accustomed to use in making HTA decisions. And there are additional challenges such as small numbers of patients can be recruited because of clinical feasibility constraints, which impacts the ability to do head-to-head comparative trials or to randomize, and therefore you often end up with single-arm trials with small number of patients, which present numerous limitations. For a start, to be able to substantiate comparative effectiveness claims, but also for statistical significance of the outcomes measured in that particular single-arm trial. And in some cases, surrogate outcomes are used, which need to be validated with hard clinical outcomes and to be translated into something that can be used in the cost-utility analysis. And in some cases, we've seen with Luxturna, which is another ATMP for a type of blindness, there was no comparative treatment or outcome measures available when that therapy was developed for that specific target patient population. And the manufacturers had to engage both regulators and market access stakeholders to agree a suitable outcome, which was developed and validated, and that was used subsequently in the clinical development. I'm not going to go into any depth here about this slide. Leslie has already talked about the different pricing scenarios. Confidential discounts are the most popular across all healthcare systems because that's how the more traditional medicines are being admitted to reimbursement. The conditional reimbursement mechanism in the UK up to this point was limited to oncology through the Cancer Drug Fund, but now is expanding beyond it through the introduction of the Innovative Medicines Fund. And as far as the outcomes-based reimbursement is concerned, there has been a lot of publicity as from 2016, and they looked at those as a potential solution for the challenges that ATMPs such as Kymriah and Yescarta present, but we haven't actually seen them in practice, at least in the UK, but we have seen them in other countries, as I will explain in a minute. The NICE Regenerative Medicine study in 2016 identified 3 metrics that can be used as part of the cost utility analysis that can help inform on the optimal selection of a payment mechanism. These three metrics are the incremental net health effects, the probability of the therapy being cost-effective, and the consequences of decision uncertainty. The first two need to be maximized, and the third one need to be minimized. And as you can see in the different scenarios here of payment schemes, performance-based annuities provides the best option in the particular illustrative scenario. However, innovative reimbursement mechanisms, although they provide advantages in terms of providing a mechanism for fair pay for therapy value, enable addressing data uncertainty and budget impact and affordability challenges, especially if payments are spread over time. They present potentially commercial viability challenges for manufacturers if payments have to happen over a long-term horizon and manufacturing costs are very high. Therefore, the upfront cost for the manufacturer takes a long time to recoup. And there's a challenge around the feasibility to implement in a healthcare system because they're much more burdensome than the simple transactions of delivering and paying for a therapy. So looking at how all this has worked out for Kymriah and Yescarta across these European markets that you can see here and England. So in England, Kymriah and Yescarta have been admitted to reimbursement through the Cancer Drug Fund. The prices that you can see on the right-hand side column are list prices, and they're not a true reflection of the price that any of these healthcare systems is actually paying. The confidential discounts apply, and therefore we don't have visibility. So in England, the reassessment is after 5 years, and that happens at cohort level. In France, a similar mechanism applies, but the reassessment takes place every year based on real-world evidence. In Italy and Spain, these are the two countries where they have actually introduced true outcomes-based payments, and these are staged, and we can see that they extend here up to 12 months in Italy. However, and as Leslie mentioned, the uncertainty extends well beyond the 12 months following administration. So what we see here is a compromise, is a form of risk sharing where the risk is shared between the manufacturer and the healthcare system, because there is still uncertainty beyond those 12 months that the patients who have demonstrated remission, they can sustain it. For hematological cancers, 36 months, it's still a critical period. Now, what is very important for this type of innovative reimbursement mechanisms is the availability of data collection infrastructure. So in England, to support the conditional reimbursement of Kymriah and Yescarta, there are two broadly speaking data sets. The first one is the long-term follow-up of pivotal trials. That is the responsibility of the manufacturer. And the second one is data collected from routine clinical practice using the existing systemic anti-cancer therapy data set, as well as the BlueTech high-cost drugs management system. In France, they leveraged an existing registry for the same purpose, which is called the Lymphoma Academic Research Organization Registry, the LYSARC. In Italy, for a number of years, they have been operating performance-based reimbursement, especially for oncology. And the IFA registry is well geared to accommodate any novel therapy that launches, and there is a web-based tool and that offers the opportunity for customization for the specific outcomes applicable to a given therapy and the time horizon over which these need to be collected. A similar system was only recently developed in Spain with these novel therapies launching in mind, and this is called the ValterMed, and was piloted using Kymriah and Yescarta. Those were the first therapies to pilot this new data collection and management system. We have produced a couple of publications on the subject. If you want more detail, you can find it here. And this presentation will become available to all of you. Therefore, you have access to the references. One last thing from me. As much as we talk about the reimbursement that is provided for the drug acquisition, we should not forget that substantial costs happen at hospital level to deliver those therapies, and appropriate tariffs need to be in place to compensate hospitals for this high cost delivery. So in England, we have a tariff of £92,000, which is adjusted for market forces, and covers the patient pathway from decision to treat until 100 days, and additional payments are happening, which are not included in this, but they are covered. Most importantly, supportive drug costs and critical care, because some patients require long hospitalization, ICU, to this point. However, this tariff needs to be revised based on more recent data of how these therapies and how hospitals perform in delivering those therapies, because as knowledge of detecting early side effects, for instance, improves, then so will the overall cost to the healthcare system for the hospital administration. Finally, we have a misalignment because there isn't a direct mechanism to compensate hospitals for the infrastructure needed to deliver these therapies, which are very disruptive, whether it's increasing ICU capacity, staff, or training, and so on. And there is a need to join up infrastructure planning with service delivery planning. And that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Panos. Another very thought-provoking and data-rich presentation. So we're going to move swiftly on to our third and final panelist, and just a reminder that after that we'll have a panel discussion and the Q&A. And our third and final panelist is Shane Gannon, who's sector lead for pharma and life science consulting at PwC in Ireland. So over to you, Shane.
Hello, thanks very much, Tony. I'm actually just having trouble starting my video because the host is disabled. So
I wonder if production support, can we do anything to help, Shane?
There you go. There you go. Hey, everybody. Sorry about that. Good afternoon. So yeah, thanks very much for the time today. So just waiting for the slides to share. So I too will be talking a bit about cell and gene therapy examples and their adoption in Ireland. And this is primarily based on a report that we published last year in the area. So I'll try to limit the level of repetition with some of the other great presentations today. But if we just move on to the first slide, just to kind of talk a bit about why we feel that they're important. So if we could move to the next slide. Yeah, sorry, back one, please. Yeah. So at the moment, really, if you look at it from an innovation perspective, medicine is sort of progressing at a sort of faster pace from what you'd call a sort of one-size-fits-all approach towards ever more precise treatments that are sort of tailored to patients. What that sort of means is, if you look back into the sort of after some of the initial sort of big drug breakthroughs, which are serendipitous, so if you think penicillin, some of the antipsychotics, we had a sort of one-size-fits-all sort of treatment approach. That has kind of evolved over the years, where you had sort of rise of sort of rationally designed therapies that are targeted towards groups or individual drug targets. You kind of moved then in the late 2010s towards training immuno-oncology, which would sort of train the body's immune system to fight diseases, and to kind of where you are now, which is an interesting space with cell and gene therapies, which are really at the sort of cutting edge of sort of treatments that are pharmacological treatments that are available to patients at this point in time. So really what you're looking to do is to use these type of treatments to sort of treat, prevent, and in certain cases, there's the potential to sort of cure those, genetically and acquired diseases. And you kind of move into some of the more future stuff, which is already happening around omics. Genomics, proteomics, the use of artificial intelligence and R&D in chemical synthesis, the use of machine learning and identifying targets. So moving ever increasing use of sort of data to sort of yield insights, and even into the future where you're talking about potential use of like nanotechnology, 3D printing, so 3D printed tissues, topics like that. So as I said, at the moment, focusing on cell and gene because it's really sort of still at the sort of cutting edge, and you're starting to see sort of some real and exciting breakthroughs in sort of treatment of diseases and kind of a signpost to what the future may look like. On the next slide, I won't spend much time on this. I would just say that I too will talk briefly about cell therapies. So in this case, we're talking about CAR-Ts, and then also a brief example of a gene therapy. But at the risk of repeating myself, I won't spend too much time on this. So if we could just move to the next slide, just to talk a bit about CAR-Ts. So as has been explained, CAR-Ts are a patient's own immune cells that are extracted from the body, are altered so that they can respond to the cancers, typically blood cancers, that patients are suffering from, and then are re-injected back into the body. So they're effectively an immune response, a patient's own immune response to those type of cancers. So at the moment, they are used, and I'll talk a bit about this in a few minutes as well, for patients that often have failed all of the other or most of the other conventional treatment options. And on the left here, we've just put in some examples of some of the type of impact that these can have. So the first panel on the left, you would see that the overall response rate. So if you look at about 80% of children, young adults with ALL responded well to the treatment, compared to, now it's not a direct comparison, but compared to historically, you'd expect around sort of 20% to respond to that. And then if you look at on the right, so 3 years after treatment, again, you would see about 47% survive versus about 20% that historically you would expect to see. I think you may have heard on the news there that some of the first CAR-T patients have actually, effectively been cured in the press, saying effectively been cured of their cancer. So, 47%, just under half would survive, and that compares quite favorably to if they had not received the treatment. So that's one example. Again, won't spend too much time out because the presenters have kind of talked through them a bit in detail. I think the second example, if we could move to the next slide, talks here a bit about, again, a gene therapy for spinal muscular atrophy, which is sort of a rare neuromuscular disease that actually results in sort of progressive and irreversible loss of motor neurons. So eventually, and very quickly, patients' muscle functions, breathing, swallowing, and basic movement are impacted. And if it's left untreated, will lead to death or the need of permanent ventilation at the age of 2 or more in about 90% of cases. So on the right here, what we've just shown is that, if you give patients at a very young age this gene therapy or a gene therapy like this, you would expect to see them here at about 20 months, which is the latest follow-up we had at the time. You see them developing quite well or quite normally, and their probability of survival without ventilation is practically the same as if they were normal, right? So they are hitting some or quite a lot of the development milestones, and if you compare it to the natural history, you will see that their chance of living without ventilation is considerably higher. Now, what we don't have here is obviously standard of care and what the current standard of care is. And those are some of the issues that we'll kind of address a bit later. And other people have touched on this as well as part of the presentation. So as I said, those are two examples. It is an interesting and dynamic space. So on the next slide, what you can see is at the moment, there have been 19 cell and gene therapies approved to date by the EMA. A few, starting from about 2019 and then really starting to ramp up from about 2018 onwards, where you have several CAR-Ts, several gene therapies. So about 19 at the moment that have been approved at some stage within the European Union across a broad spectrum of disorders. And that's expected to continue. So if we could look at the next slide, if you look at the sort of clinical trial space, you would see there's about 1,000 ongoing trials where biopharma is a sponsor. So open ongoing trials where with the biopharma company as a sponsor. So kind of if you also just kind of take out the early stage, so phase 1, phase 2, and you start to look at phase 2, 3, and 3. what you'll see is that on the right there is the sort of trial breakdown. So huge amount of focus on oncology. And the vast majority of the trials that are running in this space are for CAR-Ts. So there are a lot of oncology trials, a lot of various CAR-T trials being run at this time. And so there's a lot of data coming down the pipeline in this area. And some of the other ones then you would have sort of autoimmune CNS cardio. So examples there would be an autoimmune inflammation, could be the likes of Crohn's disease. In CNS, you'd have several sort of rare diseases. Cardiovascular would be the likes of hemophilia would be a good example. So again, a broad spectrum of sort of diseases, but the overwhelming sort of focus for the moment is in oncology. And the second interesting part about this is that only about of the 350 trials, about 60 to 70 of those are being sponsored by top 20 pharmacos exclusively. So what you're seeing is a lot of smaller biotechs, a lot of smaller companies are getting into this space, are developing therapies here. So it's an area of very high innovation area, high change, driven by a lot of smaller companies that are focusing on rare diseases and on these sort of applications. So just on the next slide, there is a lot of activity, but at the moment, patient numbers are still relatively small. So again, what we looked at here is we've just been in the sort of total patient numbers, but what we should say is that not all patients will be eligible for the treatment. So when you look at cancer, although they're between 6,000 to 11,000 depending on the cancer, patients at the moment are the treatment are only eligible as a third-line therapy. So they will have had to gone through at least two chemoimmunotherapy regimes that are proven ineffective, and then they also will need to be able to have a sort of a bone marrow transplant or stem cell transplant. So it's again a much smaller subsection of patients. And then probably another aspect of that is if you look at neurodegenerative or degenerative disorders, such as retinitis pigmentosa, or as we said, spinal muscular atrophy. Again, here these therapies are really about preserving the function that's there. So really what you're talking about, one is sort of specific treatments that are targeted towards individual genes. And the second part is that a lot of these patients must have a certain amount of functioning cells left in place to allow for these therapies to sort of, halt or modify the progression of the disease. So it's again, no point giving, or there's very little clinical benefit for giving it to people that have progressed to complete blindness. So really what you're talking about these therapies is the earlier, the better. And the earlier you talk about diagnosis, the better. So again, all of these here would be classed as a rare disease or an orphan. And these drugs, treat them would be classed as orphan drugs just because of the small number of patients, relatively small number of patients that are impacted and are eligible for treatment. So on the next slide, but that being said, commercialization, as people have hinted, has been proven very challenging to date. So our colleagues in the US and PwC looked at commercialization of gene therapies, at least 4 therapies, which you can see there on the left. And what they've actually shown is that the sort of the climb to peak sales is a lot shallower than what you'd expect with other types of treatment. So they followed sort of 14 therapies, and sort of the sort of climb in sales is quite slow compared to some of the other type of treatments. And then also in the European market, so I did share those, there have been 19 approvals, but 5 or 6 of those have been withdrawn from the market for various reasons. So you can see there on the left, Bluebird Bio recently withdrew a treatment and will likely withdraw another treatment because they haven't been able to agree on reimbursement within Europe. Several others, MolMed, primarily for poor clinical efficacy after a conditional approval, and then the likes of Dendreon, which again had a challenging sort of reimbursement process for ProBench. So about 5 of these products have been withdrawn, and sort of sales growth and the overall sort of growth within the segment has been slower than people were expecting. And the reason for that is, as people have said, it's an extremely difficult area for people to sort of think about in terms of reimbursement. So if we could move to the next slide. I won't go through all of these in detail, but I would just say that there are sort of several challenges. As people have said, they're extremely expensive, list prices ranging from 300 to 2 million. There's uncertain long-term efficacy, as we've said. There's the use of sort of novel or unvalidated efficacy endpoints. There may be new endpoints, or there may be endpoints that have not been previously used to predict disease outcomes. And this is often the case in rare diseases, where it's not been possible before to really target, say, a genetic defect that is causing a disease. So there's really no history in terms of how changing this or how ameliorating the defect will actually impact sort of long-term disease outcomes. Finally, then there's kind of tied into that, as people have said, data could be more robust in terms of a lot of them are sort of open single-arm trials. And there's been challenges in sort of data collection. It's difficult, and assessments sort of may undervalue alternative intermediate or novel endpoints. Now, it should be said that in certain cases, so certainly in the case of CAR T, some of these will go away are going away now and will go away in the sort of short to medium term. So you're already seeing several CAR T treatments are moving, those treatments, the clinical development programs are moving into sort of developing trials targeting second line where there is an established standard of care. So you will start to see head-to-head comparisons with other treatments, as Leslie showed in the first example. You will start to see, they have been approved now in Europe for 4 years. You will start to see longer term outcomes data to be able to sort of understand how efficacious these products are. So on the CAR T, some of these will go away, but it's hard to say that a lot of these will go away if you're talking about a rare disease or ultra rare disease, where you may have 3 or 4 patients, 2 patients a year. It's very hard to sort of see in a sort of a manageable time frame where you'll be able to develop the sort of robust long-term clinical data or validate sort of efficacy endpoints, in a period that sort of allows you to get these therapies to patients and to impact their treatments in the sort of short to medium term. So some will go away depending on the treatment area. Some will I think will be stuck with these or just intrinsic issues with the types of diseases that are being treated. And I think then if you can just move to the next slide. I won't going to go through this because I think Hannes has kind of discussed the various different types of models. But I think on my final slide, just in terms of when we thought about the report and when we thought about the work, how to sort of bring these therapies to Ireland, we thought about sort of there are several things that would need to be done in terms of we feel it's worthwhile, or we thought it's worthwhile that an adoption policy which sort of draws together the strands from the assessment through to sort of access, how you make these products available, how do you ready hospitals for it, and then how do you sort of agree reimbursement, but 2, agree the sort of infrastructure that goes in place within the healthcare system around reimbursement. So there is probably a framework and work with the Department of Health that's required to kind of set that out and kind of sort of address it, especially as you can see there's a lot of clinical development space. There's a lot of unmet medical need, especially in sort of rare diseases. I think the other thing is, as people have said, these treatments are very expensive. Their outcomes are still, up for debate. So to sort of reduce the cost and limit sort of the risk to sort of the payers and to the state, it makes sense to sort of institute these types of reimbursement models or risk-based or value for money sort of models within Ireland. Because otherwise what you'll have a situation is it may be that these products are never reimbursed or not available here, or as we've heard anecdotally, it may be that several patients receive treatments under the drug payment scheme, where there's sort of where Ireland would have very sort of little influence in terms of the negotiating price that is associated with those. And then I think just the final point I'd like to make is, and it's the key point for I think all of the sort of models we talk about in reimbursement in the area here, and that's about data and the data infrastructure that is in place to collect it. So as Panos kind of mentioned, there's sort of in Europe, there's sort of several models from dedicated registries, say in Italy for the advanced medicines, through to sort of dedicated web tools. But all of the sort of models that have been brought in place rely on sort of timely, high quality data. And that's really a sort of challenge in terms of implementing that within the Irish healthcare system. So you could rely on individual registries that are in place for a lot of these rare diseases. But when you scale that up over many rare diseases and over cancer, it starts to become very unwieldy for both companies, but also the health system sort of track and sort of manage patient outcomes across lots of different registries, some of them European, some of them Irish, some of them set up by sort of individual sort of academics or individual healthcare practitioners who are interested in the area. So you can, in the short term, roll out these type of stopgap measures, but really in the long term, it's probably about thinking about in Ireland how we collect our data, how we measure it, and the timeliness of that, and leveraging that to sort of reduce the risk and sort of reimbursement for these type of products. So the key for us is definitely on the data side. And so with that, I'll leave it there at that. Thanks very much, Tim.
Thanks, Shane. You covered a huge amount of ground there and packed a lot in, and you even managed to kind of advertise the next seminar in this series, which is uncovering the value of real-world data. So I'd like to ask the panel to come back online as we move towards the panel discussion and the Q&As. So both Panos and yourself, Shane, you talked a lot about and covered the different approaches being taken in different countries. And I just wondered whether between yourselves or Leslie, there'd be any thoughts as to what country offers the best current approach that we might like to follow or examine most interestingly. Do you have any thoughts on that, Shane?
So I think if you take it from the perspective of both from a burden, from a healthcare, from the provider burden, but also from the company burden, the ones where you look at sort of not individual patient-based reimbursement, but sort of cohort-based price adjustments. So similar to what the UK would do, where you would review it periodically in terms of what's happening and then adjust the price or adjust your individual payments. I think that would sort of tread a fine line between them. The reason I say that is if you think of the profile of companies that are developing this, a lot of them are very small and may not have the capabilities to sort of track individual patients or individual outcomes and sort of build that across many markets. So, and then also at the same side from a healthcare system, especially in ours, we're just not set up really to track individually.
Panos, your thoughts?
Yes, I agree to some extent because of the challenges we face with collecting individual patient data and informing the patient mechanism, and informing the payment mechanism on an individual patient basis. This is very highly administrative. This is why we're not seeing much willingness for true outcomes-based reimbursement mechanisms in NHS England, for instance. So the cohort approach of collecting data over a longer period, analyzing that, and then making decisions whether a therapy they will continue commissioning a therapy or not seems to be working better right now. But this is a problem as new therapies are launching, for which the uncertainty will remain well beyond the 5-year period for which the the current conditional reimbursement mechanisms are providing coverage. So what happens in that situation? Our only option in this case would be the true outcomes-based reimbursement. And how do we make it less administrative burdensome? It goes back to Shane's focus on data. How can we create a digital infrastructure that enables timely, as least burdensome way of collecting outcomes data and informing reimbursement mechanisms accordingly?
So, Leslie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure if the coverage with evidence development is really optimal for these gene therapies where you have the upfront payment. It doesn't really address the financial risk while this data is being collected. And then if you're waiting 3 to 5 years for all of this evidence to be collected, will the landscape have changed at that stage? So for example, would T-cell be used at an earlier line of treatment at that stage? Or, it's constantly evolving. There's also capacity constraints as well. If we are to go back and reevaluate a lot of these drugs, that's also a challenge and a considerable lot of resource required to do that. So I'm not sure if that is the answer. I think probably needs to be focus more on registries, but at an international level. So for example, I think there's been some talk about UNETA linking in with that's the European network of HTA agencies, linking in with the EBMT registry. So for example, outcome data being collected at a wider international level rather than it all happening nationally. But certainly the infrastructure in Ireland is very fragmented at the moment, so it is very challenging, but I think that's more the topic for the next webinar.
Okay, did any of the panelists want to respond to any of the other panelists' presentations before we move on to the Q's and A's? Nope. Everybody enjoyed each other's presentations. That's clear. So there are quite a lot of questions in. One of the questions is, what are the arguments for and against establishing additional ISA thresholds in Ireland, for example, as in the UK, for end of life, high disease severity, or very rare conditions, as Panos outlined? Well, can I put that to you, Leslie?
Yeah, I mean, this does come up quite a lot as a question. In Ireland, there's always been one approach for all medicines, so and one threshold, and cost effectiveness is dealt with that way. However, that was why I always show that slide where it outlines the Health Act and the criteria that are used in decision making. So it's not just the cost effectiveness that's considered, but there are wider issues that are considered, such as the severity of the disease, the unmet need, and so it is considered in a different way. But we don't adjust the cost effectiveness analysis depending on the disease or the severity.
Not surprisingly to you probably, Leslie, quite a lot of the questions are directed in your direction. But to be fair, I'm also going to ask other panelists to come in. So Shane or Panos, did you have any thoughts on that issue? The question of the example of the UK, additional thresholds for particular conditions and end of life and so on.
I just want to say from the UK perspective, from NHS, from the English perspective, there is an issue that right now we either have an ISA threshold up to 50k pounds, and then we jump up to 100k, and there's no continuity, which is why the industry is concentrating on introducing a rarity modifier, so there is a smoother transition. So we're not only using disease burden, but also rarity to smoothly transit on that continuum and not to disadvantage certain therapies.
Thanks. So here's another question. Leslie, in your presentation, you outlined that population level performance-based reimbursement, like the UK Cancer Drugs Fund, doesn't really feature in the Irish health system. What would you see as the main barriers for that kind of reimbursement in Ireland? And in particular, what role do you think pharma companies could play to facilitate that kind of reimbursement?
I mean, I think one of the issues is the issue with collecting the data and having the infrastructure in place to do that, which is very challenging. And it's one thing when you have a drug like Zolgensma and there's 4 patients per year, but when this is all expanding, which Shane has shown really nicely in his slides, that becomes much more difficult to manage. But you could argue that there will be additional evidence from ongoing trials. And again, the issues, I've kind of said that already, like I think you're paying up front and then you're collecting this additional evidence. There's also the resource constraints in reappraising over time, and I'm not sure how that can be easily addressed. So it is certainly very challenging. There's also the confidential nature of all of these agreements as well. So there's a lack of transparency there too.
Can I put that one to you as well, Shane?
Yeah, so I think when we were looking at this, we did talk to a lot of healthcare professionals that do collect data, but so when I said that in the short term you can rely on either international registries or individual sort of local registries to help plug that gap, and there is a data gap in terms of what's available, especially while our data can be high quality and is considered very open. if you look at it in cancer, it can be quite out of date. It's very hard to sort of use that data sort of to adjust pricing or to think about it from a patient perspective. So there really is, I think, a discussion about how much of that you push into international registries and how fit they are for doing that, if they have to be used in multiple different markets, which, as we saw, there are different sort of contracting models, versus how much as a country and as a healthcare system we take that on board ourselves to think about the type of data that needs to be sort of collected. So, our personal views, or my views, in the shorter term, you can make these treatments available in a sort of risk adjusted way, but you'll be relying on not an ideal setup. And as Leslie said, as there are more products come on the market, it's going to become very difficult to sort of manage that. So part of it is about standardizing the data or collecting it. Part of it about is, perhaps it's a sort of standard trigger in terms of if the treatment delivers in terms of what it's expected to deliver, transitions towards a more, standard pricing plus volume discount model or something. So there are different approaches, but I think the key challenge for us in the short term is what's our view and what's our vision for how we collect and how we create the data, and how we link that to the reimbursement process and the payment models and the sort of the value demonstration that goes with that.
Did you want to comment on that, panels?
I just want to mention that in England, there are a number of initiatives. I mean, the most important one is under the Accelerated Access Collaborative, where there has been a focus on a digital infrastructure specifically. I mean, it partly concentrates on managed access because they need to put a process in place to identify through horizon scanning products that a few years before they reach the HTA stage are likely candidates for managed access, and therefore explore the real world evidence data collection infrastructure needed to implement those type of arrangements, and take corrective steps where needed, optimization steps to optimize that digital infrastructure. And in parallel, there's a sort of that longer term project vision about linking existing registries, optimizing them, creating interoperability, something that we have seen with the systemic anti-cancer treatment database, where certain types of data come from different sources to build the bigger picture, with the electronic patient record being very central. So there are different initiatives that a country is worth initiating in order to bring all relevant stakeholders under one roof, especially the digital aspects of the healthcare system, in this case, the NHS Digital, to agree way forward.
Thanks. Here's one that I think is probably Leslie is best placed to answer, which is how is the voice of the patient built into the assessment of these medicines?
So the I did mention that in my slides, just around the process, that the NCPE have developed a patient organization submission process. So we actually employed a stakeholder engagement pharmacist at the NCPE a number of years ago, who has developed the communication with patient organizations and the process where patient organizations can make submissions of evidence. So there's a particular section on the NCPE website for patients, and we proactively engage. So once the decision has been made that a HTA is required for a particular medicine, there's a proactive engagement with the patient organization, and there's a standard template which can be filled out, and a submission can be made. That's submitted alongside the HTA report, and it's presented to the HSE drugs group when they're making their decisions. So there's also, like, plain English has been developed for all of our reports, and so there's been quite a lot of work done to make all the information accessible to patient organizations.
Thank you for that, Leslie. Here's a slightly kind of philosophical, challenging question that says that economists would argue that the state, as the payer, should be risk neutral, i.e. not willing to pay a premium for great uncertainty. So does the panel think an unintended consequence of the payment mechanisms discussed could be that decision makers will be willing to pay more per quality if uncertainty is reduced? Who'd like to take that? Shane?
Thanks, Tony. So I don't know. I think you're getting into sort of an area where you're talking about different valuations for effectively what the quality is, right? So I mean, for sure, as you get, I guess, more data, you can be reasonably confident that a certain percentage will predict it. But obviously, on when it gets down to individual patient level, you can never kind of provide that certainty. So I think I would feel, a risk-adjusted quality. I would feel uncomfortable discussing that, or kind of uncomfortable advocating for that, just purely if we're taking it on a philosophical level, what it means when you play it forward and the implications for us on an individual, on a personal basis, or for individual patients. I mean, you're telling them that because you have a greater certainty of being cured or treated with this disorder, you're more likely to get a treatment because it's more likely to be reimbursed. Is a difficult place to be, I think, for people.
Panos?
I agree. The only thing with Shane, that is, the only other thing I can add is that perhaps there is a scope for an innovation, to be taken into account in willingness to pay, because the healthcare system can benefit long-term from the progression of that innovation, as much as the very first treatment of a particular type, say CAR-T, is not associated with the high confidence in a curative scenario based on the numbers we've just seen, but follow-ups and the evolution of that mechanism of action and technology that can occur by allowing the first generation of CAR-Ts being adopted, that can provide long-term benefits to the healthcare system and the economy. So that's the perspective I take on this.
Okay. We've got quite a few questions in that really focus on the timeliness and the timeline in the approval process, which is probably no surprise to any of us. So I'll just take a couple of specific questions, if that's all right. So one relates to the SMA example. And the question is, it appears that the price was agreed in June, and wonders why the MMA then was not finalized and approved until November, giving rise to the general question, what needs to happen in the interim period to potentially speed these things up? That'd be something you'd feel happy to talk about, Leslie?
I can try. It's not exactly within our remit, but I can, just give my thoughts on it. But one of the issues maybe when is the decision made that a managed access protocol is needed, and at what stage the M&P are brought in. There also needs to be, the protocol needs to be established, so that is done in conjunction with clinicians. So the clinical leads for the particular therapeutic area are involved. So that does take time, but I mean it's not something that I'm specifically involved in. And I also think that it's still quite early for some of these treatments, and I do think as time goes on there'll be more streamlining of it. So it is still in development.
There's a similar question in relation to CAR-T, and just by way of passing, I should say, a lot of comment in the chat, recognizing the important points that Panos made about the on-cost to hospitals and so on that arise from the delivery of such schemes, which I suspect could be a whole seminar in itself. But this questioner, while commenting that CAR-T is clearly exciting and innovative with the potential for cure, there's two questions. It's taken over 3 years for CAR-TP assessment in Ireland before reimbursement. And again, how do we improve speed to access? What's the trick? What's the mechanism by which we can do that, given that this is one where we did get to access? So Shane or Leslie or Panos, whoever would like to come in first on that one.
I can say, I'm sorry.
No, go on.
I can say that one reason why CAR-Ts were adopted very quickly in NHS England is that for innovative oncology drugs, the HTA assessment, the NICE assessment happens in parallel with a regulatory assessment, and always the ambition is that by the time they conclude, they kind of coincide and there's no delay. And the other reason was preparing the NHS infrastructure for the burdensome delivery of these therapies in advance.
Shane?
Yeah, I think I was going to point, first of all, that I think the NHS managed to get them into patients relatively quickly compared to others. I think what we saw is that in general there is a frustration with the timeline end to end for once it's starting the process to getting it into patients, into a care setting for patients. So there's definitely scope across the process for kind of streamlining that, and then also thinking about in terms of the future. How do you manage the sort of sheer volume of some of these products that will come down the line? So, there is certainly things that can be done around that. A lot of that, or some of that, is from the government, from the Department of Health side. I think some of that can also be from companies in terms of, if you take the CAR-T example, about ensuring that the various hospitals are set up and are certified to be able to deliver those. So there is, I think, a bit to do on both sides, but I think there is a definite need, and looking at the UK and how they've managed it, there is a definite need and scope there for accelerating it.
Did you want to add anything, Leslie, on the time interval, please?
I mean, I think it is clear that the commercial negotiations took a very long time with the CAR-T, and ultimately when a decision was made, the drugs group were satisfied then with what was finally agreed, but it took a long time. So I think also, that does happen sometimes with these commercial negotiations. So if companies come forward with realistic pricing as well, I think that does help up front. There is also resourcing issues. So for example, the infrastructure that's needed within the hospitals, and that Shane's already touched on.
Okay. I have another interesting question that's come in relation to whether there is an argument for some increased alignment between the clinical evidence requirements that go into the regulatory approval, be that HPRA or EMA on the one hand, and the requirements of evidence for the reimbursement agency, NCPE in this case. Could there be an evidence for trying to align those processes to perhaps reduce the bottleneck and get some synchronicity?
Unfortunately, the gap seems to be widening. It seems to be going the other way with the earlier approval, and like even what Panos was saying in the UK, they're even assessing the drugs before regulatory approval, but the gap seems to be widening rather than going the other way, which is very challenging, because it also means that the process for evaluating medicines is much more complex, because we're getting into conducting indirect treatment comparisons, which are very complex, rather than having this direct comparative evidence available.
Right, I'm just going to try and squeeze in two more questions before we have to bring to a close. And there's a broad level question about whether there is value in aspiring towards a more partnership approach between the state and pharma in capturing outcomes data from patients to inform pay and performance issues. What in general, are there any good examples that we can point to that we could perhaps consider adopting here? Nobody's rushing. It's clearly a challenging. The questioner points to Italy, for example, as a possible way forward. I mean, in your comparative work, Panos, have you settled on anywhere that you think is doing it better?
So the partnerships between industry and the healthcare system, key market access stakeholders, is key for a variety of things. Not only on individual therapy basis for those negotiations for access and commissioning, but also on large infrastructure projects. For example, in the UK, the Systemic Anti-Cancer Treatment Database was largely had large industry mobilization and involvement. The Accelerated Access Collaborative that I'm referring to has input from the industry associations. So I don't know the evolution of I cannot recall the evolution of the IFA registry in Italy and what role industry played. So you can all comment on this.
Shane?
Yeah, again, I'm not sure how much what you hear about is individual companies working with payers and with regulators to sort of ensure that the quality of data is there, but fundamentally they're on either side of a commercial arrangement or contractual arrangement. So some of it seems to be driven by that. I do suspect, I do feel that there's a willingness, and that it would be viewed as a win-win to collaborate on it in more detail and sort of build understanding and capabilities. But again, when you look at the specific examples that have been put in place, I'm not sure. I don't see how much input sort of the industry has had in sort of developing those. So in terms of in Spain, as Panna said, in Italy, and then also in Germany.
Coming from the point of view of the price regulator, Leslie, do you think there's potential for those kinds of partnerships, or is it too difficult?
Well, it comes more under the remit of the corporate pharmaceutical unit within the HSE. I do think there is, there has to be independence as well in the data collection, and I'm not sure, really there are challenges with it. I'm not sure if it's more appropriate maybe for like capitalizing on the existing data infrastructures that are in place, for example, more linkage of existing databases, for example, the cancer registry with PCRS or ODMS data, which may be less burdensome once it's established as well.
Very good. And finally, in this time that we have available, and I'm sorry for all the other questioners that I wasn't able to get all the questions in because there was a huge response on the Q&A. Kind of a local question here. What is the likely impact of the pending FINA-FOL bill on orphan drugs legislation to remove the 45K QALY for orphan drugs? What kind of impact could that have if that was brought forward into legislation? Perhaps Leslie might say something on that.
Yes, I don't have all the figures to hand, but I have seen that if you look at the drugs that have been assessed over the years with orphan status and the savings that have been made to the state, it comes into hundreds of millions of euros through the work that's done through HTA and the commercial negotiations on pricing. So I don't see how you can really justify that, and in the absence of using the current approach, is there a better approach, and has that been put forward? I don't think so.
Any thoughts on the orphan drugs issue from Panos or Shane? No. Fair enough. Well, our time has come to an end. I'd like to thank the RCSI Healthcare Outcomes Research Centre for organising today's event, supported by Janssen and Novartis. I'd like to thank our three panellists for excellent presentations, and also thank everyone for participating. As Jan mentioned, this is one of a series, and the next, very topically, will be on the subject of uncovering the value of real-world data. That's due to happen in early April. And if you watch this space for further information, I hope that you'll be able to join us then. With that, I'm going to bring the webinar to a conclusion. And thanks to everyone for participation, especially our panelists. Thank you very much.